Right, Talofa, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Unity Robeck, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this SPREP webinar, where we will be launching and introducing the Sea Turtle Monitoring Manual. I would like to go around the room and introduce my colleagues who were involved in the development of this manual. Shall we start first with Nick?
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, as in how the time zones catch you. I'm dialing in from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, where it's now, I believe, 5 o'clock in the morning. And I'm looking forward to being able to share this with you today.
Thanks, Nick. Karen?
Hello for everybody. My name is Karen Beard. I'm the Threatened and Migratory Species Advisor for the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, and I'm very excited to be here at the launch of this manual.
Thanks, Karen. Carlo?
Hola from Suva in Fiji. I'm here at the Pacific Bioscapes Program Office with Alishaw, Etienne, and myself. Hello to everybody.
Thanks, Carlo. And my name is Unity Robeck. I am the Turtle Database and Conservation Officer. And it is a privilege to have you all join us today. Our webinar today will have our agenda, as you can see on the screen now, and we will move on to welcoming remarks from Karen.
Thanks, Unity. Talofa, and a very warm welcome to everyone for joining us today. It's great to see so many familiar faces and also some new ones. First, I would like to acknowledge our funders for the Pacific Bioscapes Program, the European Union, which has funded the production of this manual. All 6 species of marine turtles found in the Pacific are now faced with extinction, despite having been around for over 100 million years. Hawksbill and leatherback turtles are critically endangered. Green are endangered, and loggerhead and olive ridley are vulnerable. Marine turtles face a range of threats from unsustainable take, including illegal take of adults and eggs, fisheries interactions, including with active gear and ghost nets, habitat loss, pollution including from light and plastics, predators, and the impacts of climate change. Their life history characteristics, such as late sexual maturity, increase their vulnerability. A turtle needs to survive for 20 or 30 years before being able to start reproducing. Understanding how populations are managing in the face of these challenges is critical to directing resources to where they are needed most. To do this, we need good long-term population trend data across the Pacific, particularly at key breeding sites for each species. This might sound simple, but turtle biology is complicated, and as you will discover when you read this manual. Iconic and culturally and spiritually important, Pacific Islanders are already making enormous efforts trying to protect the turtles we love from extinction. We hope this easy to read and engaging manual will be an asset for responsible government agencies, NGOs, communities, and students in unraveling how best to go about monitoring of marine turtles to meet your specific needs and help focus conservation action where it is most needed. Finally, I want to acknowledge and thank Dr. Nick Pilcher for the enormous amount of his knowledge that he has poured into the development of this manual, our colleague Carlo Lacovino for the design, and especially Lim Sheng Ho for the wonderful illustrations of turtles which have enhanced the manual. Thanks also to Unity for organising this webinar. It gives me great pleasure to be opening this webinar today. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Next on our agenda is the Turtle Monitoring Manual. An introduction and brief background of the manual, as well as a walkthrough by Dr. Nicholas Cook. Thanks, Nick. You're on mute, Nick.
Yeah. Alrighty. Hopefully everybody can see this now. And I'll get started. So again, good morning, good afternoon, depending on time zones, wherever you are. And it is a real honor for me to present this manual to you. It's taken quite a lot of work. I got carried away with the writing and put quite a lot of thought and effort into this, and so it's really exciting that finally it's ready and it's available for distribution. So I'd first like to at least to acknowledge the SPREP program and the Pacific Bioscapes funding for this process, and also as you've seen, this has been a bit of a team effort pulling it all together at the end, especially with the layout and organizing this launch. So without wanting to spend loads of time introducing it, I thought at first I'd give you a rough idea of how I approached this. It started out that SPREP had asked whether or not I could write a tagging manual. And I didn't think a tagging manual was really what we needed. And I completely understood where SPREP were coming from in wanting to get tagging programs organized and working in a cohesive manner. But really it got me thinking that tagging was nothing more than one of the many tools available to us to undertake monitoring and research for marine turtles. And so after some emails back and forth, we finally agreed that really it would be a lot more practical for people to have a manual that kind of guided them down a path towards selecting the most appropriate research or monitoring tools that might be out there. And as you can see here on the screen, the idea, the premise is that tagging is nothing more than a tool, just like a screwdriver is for fixing a screw into a piece of wood or out. Tagging is a tool that we use to answer specific questions related to turtle biology and ecology. But tagging a turtle doesn't save it. And really, when we sort of take a step back, the idea is, you know, what's the objective? What are we really trying to get out of this? What are we trying to do? And so I spent quite a bit of time getting to the point where we define the question and try and identify what it is exactly that we want to know. My goal right at the very beginning was to present the manual in a very sort of easy and friendly and accessible way. And as you can see from our little baby turtle here on the side of the screen, I actually had an artist help me with this, and I hope that the graphics through the manual and the way I've written the text presented in a very accessible way to you. My intent was never to be condescending or to be insulting, and I hope it doesn't come off that way as you read through the manual. The idea was to try and present it very much the way my mind thinks of it. So I've typed it out as if I was having a conversation with you, rather than in some sort of very, very obscure scientific language. As to whether or not that worked, then I'm going to leave that up to you. And once you get a chance to read through the manual, you can get back to me and let me know. And I'm really, really hoping that it works out the way I envisioned. So with that in mind, the way I thought we'd spend some time today is to go through what's inside the manual and why I laid it out the way I did. And I'll try and use some specific examples to highlight points here and there. And at the end, really, I want to open it up for questions and from you, and see if I can do my best to answer those in the time we have. So really, I kind of think that the manual is a bit of a how-to manual, how to do this. And as I wrote in the acknowledgements, you know, I kind of hope that it fits into your library of books and resources that help you identify, you know, what you could be doing, or what you might best be doing to answer questions you have. It's based on a number of years of experience that I've had working in the field, but also leans on the hundreds and hundreds of years of experience that others have working on this topic, that I've tried to bring all together and put them together for you. I guess the thinking at the beginning was that we often are looking for the right tool to use to get underway with turtle research or monitoring, and there are a lot of tools out there, but not every one of those is appropriate to the question you might have. And so the idea, what I'm hoping is that this sort of takes things all one at a time. You know, we start out with the very, very basics and then move on from there. I'm going to say up front that this manual is not going to cover absolutely every single thing you could ever hope to study with sea turtles. It doesn't do that, and it certainly could never do that. What I am focusing on in this manual is really the very, very basic questions that can help answer, and particularly answer to what is the status of my turtles in my country or in my region. And so instead of getting involved in sort of breathing rates and stable isotopes and eyesight and things like that, it really is looking at the very basic things that we really need to know, which is about turtle numbers and locations. And so we start out with the basics, and hopefully by just taking this approach, you can all as well kind of get the idea of how you might move forward with other more complicated or more complex questions you might have further down the road. With that in mind, I thought I'd sort of give you an idea of how I think of some of the most important information that are needed to save a species or to manage a species. And really, I think of those as being just three key things. How many turtles do I have? And if we knew that, of course, we would be able to determine whether that number was growing or shrinking over time. Where are they? Because if we don't know where they are, we wouldn't be in a position either to study them or to address threats. And with that last point in mind, what threats do they face so that I can manage them? And really, at the end of the day, if we want to make sure a species survives, these are the key three things we need to know. Sure, it would be nice to know loads of other details, and many of those other details go into answering some of these questions. But for the most basic approach, in my opinion, I think these are the three key things you need to focus on. Once you know how many turtles you have, and you know where they are, and you know what threats they face, you can start to manage those populations. And once you're managing them and turtles are in a good position, you probably will get involved in more complicated or more complex research questions. So the book is laid out in 6 chapters, and I'll run through them one by one very briefly. It might be a little bit of a long-winded read the first time you go through it. And one of the comments I had from one of my friends was that Yeah, there's quite a lot of text. And yes, there is. And I'm hoping that that text sets the background for some of the ways you approach turtle management and conservation studies in the future. And I made up a whole bunch of words as well, like this one down right at the very bottom. So the idea is that, you know, if you can learn all of the things that are in this manual, you'll become a much better turtle conservationologist. So starting out with chapter one is very much a review of the life cycle of turtles, but not because you don't know anything about turtles, but more importantly, so that you understand why certain pieces of information in the life cycle of turtles is important, right? So we all mentally can picture that graphic of, you know, adult turtles at the top, and the males and the females migrate, and eventually the females nest multiple times, and little baby hatchlings come out and grow up and become adults, and that's perfect. It's a great start. But why would we want to know some of those things, and how do we answer some of those things, and why is that data important? For example, why is knowing how many clutches a turtle lays in a season important, or incubation success? And some of these might be a little bit more apparent than others. Incubation success, of course, I want to know how well the eggs do in the sand and how many baby hatchlings come running down into the ocean after that. But clutch frequency, you know, how many clutches of eggs does a turtle lay in a season, might seem a little bit abstract sometimes, but it's one of those numbers that helps us translate between numbers of tracks that might be on a beach and the total number of turtles in our population, which answers one of those very first basic questions. So in this chapter, we really spend a lot of time going through the life cycle, and I use a couple of little baby call-out boxes and little examples. But the idea is to try and explain why certain metrics are important, and in answering how well our turtle populations are doing. From going through this, every time that I get to a particular thing that I think is important, I've put it in italics, and we address those a little bit later on. But one of those is track counts. So track counts is just simply how many tracks were on a beach the following morning. And that's one of the most basic measures of turtle nesting. If we walked along a beach in the morning and simply counted the tracks, we would have some idea of what was happening. Of course, if we knew what proportion of those tracks were successful, then so much the better. We could translate the number of tracks into an estimated number of nests. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, if we knew how many clutches of eggs a turtle laid in a season, we probably could translate that total number of nests into a total number of turtles, and that would be a good metric for us to track populations through time. In chapter 2, I spend a bit of time looking at the status of sea turtles, but not a lot, maybe a page or two. And it just basically showing what we know about the different species across the Pacific and what their current status may be. But then I spend quite a bit more time discussing why some of the metrics that we would like to know might not be known for the Pacific Islands region. And I'll give you an example. So clutch frequency, it's a very easy one to explain. So when we want to know clutch frequency, really what we're after is how many clutches of eggs does a turtle lay in a season? Well, in order to answer that, we would at least need to identify each turtle. So we would have to mark them, say, with a tag. And we would have to be on the beach at the beginning of the season nearly all the way to the end so that we could see how many times each individual turtle came back to lay eggs. And then we would take an average of all of those and get an average clutch frequency for sea turtles. Well, that might be fine if the beach is just down the road and you have a whole bunch of people that are available to help you collect that information. But what about if that's on a remote island and it's quite expensive or logistically complicated or dangerous to get out to that island? Now, all of a sudden, collecting data for an entire season might not be as practical as we would like. And so clutch frequency is a number that we don't know for many parts of the Pacific, simply because of the challenges in collecting that information. That's not to say it's not available. There are places where that data is available. The Arnavon Islands in the Solomon Islands is a good example of where we know clutch frequency for hawksbill turtles. And the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, we know a clutch frequency for green turtles. But this is because these programs invest massive amounts of resources in making sure that there are teams on the beach for nearly the entire season to collect that information. So this chapter is about trying to point out why certain things might be available and why they're not, and maybe put into perspective where we might go with that information and what we might want to learn from that. So then we get to chapter 3. Now, the idea behind the manual, as I said right at the very beginning, is to try and narrow down the thought process into knowing what it is you want to know and why. And so this chapter is really about trying to get there. How many turtles do I have? Where are they? What are the threats? And then narrow down our objectives based on the answers to that question. And one of the things that I mentioned in the manual is the way I think of things like this when I'm approaching a challenge like this is not just what do I want to know, but why do I want to know it? In what way is this information going to answer a particular question I have? And of course, it's peppered with little examples here and there to give you some ideas. Here is one of the first steps. So I want to know about, right? And you might want to know about the turtle population, or you might want to know about threats. There could be a number of things that you're interested in. And then if we take that a little bit further and narrow down that question, well, you might want to know about the number of turtles for a number of reasons. You might want to know it to determine whether the population is growing or declining over time. Or you might want to know, let's see, where turtles go after they nest. So what's the connectivity between the nesting areas and the feeding areas? And we have some of that, quite a bit of that information actually for the Pacific Islands region. It's just a case of what do you need to know for your particular program. Then finally, chapter 4 is the largest chapter in the entire book. This is a big, huge chunk of text. And the idea behind this is really to say, okay, now we know what it is we want to know. So how are we going to get that information? So very much this is the main reason for the manual, right? How are we going to do what we need to do? So the first thing we do is take a look at some of the things that might limit your ability to get work done. For instance, what's manpower availability? Do you have a whole community behind you that could be helping collect data, or do you have a research team of 2 and very limited resources to be able to be on a beach for long periods of time? Do you have the resources you need in terms of funding or equipment or assets, whatever it might be? And those may shape the way you think about certain things. Do you need the information now? Or is it something you could wait for while you collect the right resources? So the way I've done it is to use a series of decision trees to narrow down a search for for a method that's most applicable for the question you have in mind. And this little sort of graphic at the bottom left of your screen it gives you, well, this is the main question, and then there's some questions that narrow down your choice of method, and finally a suggested solution or a suggested process. The way those look is a little bit like this. Do you know how many turtles nest on your beaches? And if the answer is yes, well, hey, you're done. You don't need the manual. You could continue just some regular data collection and you'd be perfectly set. But if you didn't know how many turtles nested on your beaches, then I'm hoping that these questions guide you through and try and set you up with some of the most basic methods. And a lot of the times those are much more simple than, oh, I need to be out on the beach tomorrow with 30 people counting, turtles. It might be that you just need to count tracks. It might be that you don't need to be there the entire season. And so the idea of this is really to try and narrow down what it is you might want to do and why, and to try and guide you in the direction of a certain process. Now, you'll notice on this graphic that I've labeled them as process number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And a little bit later on in this chapter, you'll see that there's a section that actually describes each one of these processes. Similarly, there's several of these decision-making processes, and some of them relate to reproductive output, some of them relate to threats, some of them relate to distribution and movement of turtles. So you have a little bit of everything to answer those 3 key questions we talked about a little bit earlier. And this is what some of those things might look like in the manual itself. You notice that there's a table with a process. It has some pros and cons and a bit of a description. And there are 25 of these, which is the number of basic things I came up with that I thought would answer just about most important questions you might have related to monitoring and research on turtles. So this is one example, so clutch incubation studies. And it starts out by having a sort of little table header, I suppose, which has some very basic text on what some of the pros of this method are, some cons. Some cons might relate to costs or to lead times or the science needed to decipher the data that comes out of it. How frequently you might want to implement this, tools you might need, and then I think quite useful is this section right on the right, which is a series of references that point you in the direction of work that's already been done related to this. So, for instance, if and these would be hyperlinks that are available to you. And so you could click on one of those hyperlinks, in this case, a study by Nicholas Mozovsky and colleagues. And then if you were to click on that, it would take you directly to the paper that was published on that material. So every single one of the 120 citations is available as a hyperlink so that you could access this and you can get some idea of how people have used this method and what some of the great things about it have been or what some of the limitations might have been. So that the idea behind these references is that the manual also helps you unlock a door to a much wider source of information on sea turtle biology. The other thing is, and I hope that I've done this justice, is these references, of course, are not the only papers that ever talk about this subject. They're just a selection of papers that I thought would be appropriate for you to read through and get a much better idea. Your ability to continue doing research down that line afterwards is entirely up to your imagination. And then finally, underneath each one of those tables is a brief description of what this method does. Some of them have some hyperlinks that send you to particular methods or surveys. Others sort of describe it in a little bit more detail. Some are more detailed than others because they introduce more complex material, or they address things that require a little bit more description. But the idea is that each one of these 25 processes has a table of pros and cons, a list of references that you can read through to get an idea of what this method will do and how it works, and then a description like this that will give you a much, sort of quite a straightforward understanding of what the method involves. So yeah, this is more my conceptual graphic. You could be anywhere in the world, and you could link on, you could be reading this on a computer, go through the manual, click on one of those hyperlinks, and it would send you to any one of these published reports, which I have already downloaded and made available in a folder ready for everybody to use. So now you've gone out there and you've collected your data, you have all of this knowledge, and you know a lot more about your turtle populations than you did in the past. And I think that one of the things that we don't do well enough is use that information across a much broader range. And so I thought I'd spend a bit of time in chapter 5 discussing how you can contribute the data you have collected into bigger data sets that answer questions like, what is the population status of sea turtles? One of the challenges that I found over the years, of course, is if somebody has a data set, but it's locked away in their office or on their computer and the world doesn't know about it, then that data set is, to all intents and purposes, not available to science. And think about the loss. If that data set was to be lost, you'd have to go out there and do that work all over again. If you share it and make it part of much bigger programs, then your data takes on a much greater value. Sure, it's your data, and it's your data to use for the assessments that you're doing, but you could also contribute it to regional assessments and to global assessments, so that things like the IUCN Red List assessments or other regional programs, including TREDS at SPREP, so that we get a much bigger picture of how turtles are doing across the region, and not just in your own backyard. And then finally, in chapter 6, I briefly go through the TREDS database and just try and point out how the TREDS database is a resource that's available to people in the Pacific Islands region, but really across the world. It's available to anyone, and it's an incredible resource that exists. And probably there are ways in which our use of it could be improved. And also ways in which we could make it more powerful. I also put a little bit of time into talking about some of the limitations with understanding the data that comes out of TREDS, because that's just as important as knowing what goes into it. For example, if people in one country don't upload data into TREDS, does that mean that there are no turtles in that country? Well, of course not, right? But if we were to just simply use the number of turtles in TREDS as a way of understanding what turtle numbers and abundance look like across the Pacific, then that would be wrong. And so we need to know how we can use that data and what it tells us, right? If a turtle migration was in TREDS that told us a turtle went from I don't know, Samoa to Fiji, then we would know that. But if that was just one track, is that representative of what all turtles do in the region, or is it just one particular turtle that happened to do that? So we need to also know a little bit about how we interpret the data that's within the TREDS database to make it as useful as possible to us. And so that's the manual. Basically, it tries to guide you on a path of making the best choices to select a method that'll answer a question you have. It focuses on the basics, I will admit. It's not all about detailed, biology and physiology of sea turtles. It's much more about the practical data we need to know to answer the question of how well are my turtles doing. And so I wanted to end this brief presentation by just saying thank you. Thank you first to the many people that have inspired a lot of the ideas I've put into this book, either through conversations or through their work and their papers that I've read, and the thoughts and the conversations I've had over multiple years of working on sea turtles. You'll notice that I specifically mention a number of people here on the screen, and these people all took a chance to read through either early versions of the book design, or in the case of George Balas and Irene, and Rob Baldwin and Brian Wallace, who took the time to read through the entire manual and comment on it and provide extremely valuable feedback. In particular, I remember sitting on a nesting beach in Saudi Arabia for a number of nights talking to Rob Baldwin about how a manual like this would be really useful and why doesn't somebody write it? And now I did. And Dubs and I have had multiple conversations about turtle biology and ecology over the years that have shaped some of these ideas. Cole has been a mentor of mine since well, at least my turtle beginning back in 1986, and so I'm extremely grateful for the time he's given me over the years and explained things to me. And as Karen mentioned right at the beginning, I think Hal has done an amazing job of bringing to life some of the stories and some of the ideas that I put forward in this manual, and hopefully make it a little bit more of an enjoyable read, so that it's not some dry scientific treatise that puts you to sleep, but rather is something that you find interesting and amusing at times, informative, and that is useful. That's the ultimate goal of it. I hope it's something that everybody finds useful at the end of the day. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you for questions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Nick. Thank you very much for that comprehensive walkthrough of the manual. Just a note to everyone, the hyperlinks that Nick mentioned in the manual, that is still a work in progress. We are trying to find a legal way to host all those publications so that we don't get slapped with any lawsuits from our scientists. So I now open the floor for any questions for Nick. Please raise your hand and turn on your camera, and we'll assign you.
Deathly silence.
Oh, go ahead, George.
You can always depend on Balaz to make some noise, you know that. But this is good noise. One of the points that Nick rightfully mentioned is, what are the threats they face? That was a key question that he mentioned in the beginning. And I would set forth the proposal that one of the best ways to find out what threats sea turtles face are through stranding programs where dead turtles, injured turtles are reported and then followed up on. And after a bit of time, one can start seeing what are the threats coming from fishery bycatch. Are they a disease? Are they shark attack? And to the best of my knowledge, there are very few stranding programs throughout Oceania. Maybe the cultures or maybe the lay of the land isn't suitable for it, but we are going to have a workshop. You knew I was going to get a plug in here on October 5th, Samoan time, Apia time, and October 6th for here in Hawaii. And the theme of the workshop is strandings, and we have 20 presentations, 15 minutes each, on various aspects of stranding programs. And I'm delighted to tell you that there will be a presentation on New Caledonia by Teflon Reed. So there are some places in Oceania that do have stranding programs, and there'll be several based on Hawaii, where we're have a network that's going on since the early 80s. So even if you can't attend by Zoom or by flying here, please just keep in mind that a way to find out the threats that a population faces, one of the main ways is through stranding studies. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Do you have any questions? Is that you, Karen?
It's me. I feel like I couldn't let Nick get away without asking one question, but I see Mark's also got his hand up. So sorry to all of you turtle biologists out there, this might be a really stupid question. But as I mentioned in my welcoming address, one of the most important things that we really need to know across the region and for each species of turtle is what is happening with populations. What is the actual trend? Is it going up? Is it stable? Is it going down? And then obviously, what are the biggest drivers of those population changes? So, if I'm thinking about seabirds, which is something I know a little bit more about, I would think, well, we probably only need to assess the population maybe every 5 years. So we only have to put resources into going and checking what the population is doing every 5 years. But I'm getting from what you're saying that you actually have to have resources to annually go to the beach that you're monitoring, because turtles have a long period in between which they come back to that beach, maybe 6 or 8 years or whatever, depending on a whole lot of things. So in order to really understand what's happening with the populations, you really have to go there every year. Is that right?
Well, there's elements of that ring true, but the key challenge is that no given year is actually representative of what turtles are doing. And there's a graph I use in the manual that uses some of George's data from Hawaii that just shows how, from year to year, the numbers can go up and down and up and down. And the data from Hawaii, the one that I've used in the manual, sure, it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, but over time, there's this general increasing trend. Now, of course, the challenge is if you go on 1 year when it's down versus a year when it's up, which of those 2 years do you use? And so the way we try to do this is try and take a running average of a number of years. And not everybody has the resources to be on the beach every single year. And I completely understand that. And probably the most useful approach in a case like this is to at least have several years of data that you can use to come up with an average. And then there can be a period in between. And for many parts of the Pacific, we have data that looks just like that, where you've got 4 or 5 years of data, and then for 5 years there's nothing, and then there's another 4 or 5 years of data. Sure, in an ideal situation, it would be nice to have data for every single year. But I recognize just how impractical and how cost prohibitive that might be from time to time and place to place. So really the idea, and this is explained in the manual, but I go into the point about how turtle numbers fluctuate across years and how any given 1 year isn't representative of what turtles are doing. It would be nice if we could collect data more frequently, but there's a lot of mathematical ways of using data that isn't as periodic as that to be able to come out with an assessment of trends. You're right. At the end of the day, the question is, are the numbers of turtles going up or down? And is the data that I collect answering that question? One of the ways to think about this is, if all you really needed to know was whether the numbers of turtles are going up or down, but you didn't really need to know whether or not, you know, a given turtle came back every second week or every 13th day, you might be better off investing effort in just simply walking the beach in the morning and counting tracks than you would in putting big teams on beaches at night at great expense for long periods to collect that information, plus a lot of other information that might not answer the question of how many turtles do I have. And hopefully the manual will point you in the direction that if all you need to know is numbers of turtles, you might not need to be on a beach tagging turtles at night, and you might not need to collect certain other information. So if anything else, I'm hoping that it helps as a way of thinking, well, these are my resources, and this is what I need to know, and therefore this is maybe the best way to do it.
Thanks.
Mark?
Yes, thanks, Unity. And thanks very much, Nicholas. That was very, very interesting, and I'm really looking forward to reading the whole manual. I'm Mark Oramus. I work for WWF based in New Caledonia. And I have a quick question for you about, you talked about the fact that you used some decision trees in your manual, which I think is a great way of doing things. And I was wondering how your manual, if it uses in some way the decision tree that has been put together by the SWOT regarding the choice of monitoring strategies depending on your conditions. I think it's a very good tool, although in our case it turns out to be kind of a dead hand, and we had to adjust our efforts because it's never very straightforward, unfortunately. But still, I was wondering how you use this information, and also I guess the second question about how the manual provides some key or guidings regarding the mathematics aspects of the data. Turns out it's following a protocol can be very simple, sometimes not that much, but how to deal with the data later on to get actually the results is really a problem, especially for local NGOs that can know very well how to collect the data on the field, but they don't really know how to use and get the result at the end because they don't have the right connections with research institutes or any experts. And I was wondering if you also point out to some ideas regarding how to do and what to do with the data. Thanks.
Yeah, both of those are really good points. So having been on the SWOT advisory committee that developed the minimum standards, of course they feature in the manual, and the decision tree that is in the SWOT book is also in this manual as an example of how to do things. I point to the SWOT minimum data standards several times in the manual, because one thing is to tell people how to go out and collect that data. The second thing is, well, how much data do I need? And there's a limit to how much I wanted to spend time on answering the second half of that. And what I've done in this case is I've pointed people towards the SWOT minimum data standards. At the same time, I completely recognize what you're saying, that sometimes collecting that information, and particularly in the Pacific region, might not be as practical, right? So I'll give you an example. So one of the examples of collecting data under the SWOT minimum data standards is to collect data 3 days a week. And now picture yourself in Tonga and needing to get in a boat and travel to a distant island to go and collect information, and have to do that 3 times a week. Well, that's just completely impractical. And so at that point, you know, the minimum data standard approach under that particular process doesn't work at all. And I try and point out these differences and these challenges as I'm going through the manual, and what might work and what might not work in many parts of the Pacific region. So yes, the SWOT minimum data standards are definitely part of the process, and I think they're very valuable. But probably there are challenges in some parts of the Pacific in implementing some of the particular ways in which they approach data collection. To answer to your second question regarding the math, so you'll read through the manual that several times I say, and if you have access to a good mathematician, modeler, statistician, you'll be in great shape. And if not, if you're like me and rely on the basics, then some of that modeling might be more of a challenge. And I refer to that part particularly when it comes to looking at peak season monitoring versus full season monitoring. So if you're on the beach for the entire season and you can use all of that data, well, then it's quite straightforward to calculate how many turtles you have. But if you can only get out to the beach for a peak 2-week period, then you probably need to have access to a good statistician that'll help you look at that data and interpret it properly. And so I've tried to point those things out. Again, I haven't been able to describe every single mathematical analysis process that's out there, but I have pointed out in those cases where having a good modeler or statistician on board is extremely important. For example, analyzing data from aerial surveys, or analyzing data from peak season counts as opposed to full nesting season counts. So I'm going to admit there are limitations to just how much information can go into a manual. But in those places where I think it's important to have a good data processing person on your team, I've pointed that out in every one of the methods. Or at least I think I have.
Thanks, Nick. Do we have any more questions for Nick? Yes, George?
Well, I just have a comment, and it goes back to when Nick first approached me about taking a look at his draft manual. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, not another tagging manual. How many do we need? How many do we want? And I do think that my voice helped him to find a better pathway for the manual that has now been created. I'd like to think that I was an influence there. I think back to the beginning of what we used to call, I guess we don't call it that anymore, the RMTCP, Regional Marine Turtle Conservation Program of SPREP, which started out by a suggestion and action by Sylvia Spring in about 1989, I think. She approached Carl Limpus and myself to create a program in SPREP. SPREP was based with the SPC then in Noumea. Later on moved to Apia. That's why you'll find still some SPREP tags, RMTCP tags, that Unity is probably well aware of, that have the SPC address in Noumea. My point is that we didn't just start doing this. SPREP didn't just launch something new. This has been going on for decades. My goodness, the year of the sea turtle was 1995. Videos, educational videos, special meetings were created. It's been a while, and SPREP has had tags since probably 1990, maybe 1989. So how many years is that? It's a lot of years. And it's all gone into the database, and whether you realize it or not, the promise of esteemed researchers taking on programs in the Pacific Islands, tagging, so many brochures, and even a manual before. I guess the point I'm trying to get at is we've done a lot of tagging work. I'll say you have done, SPREP has done a lot of tagging work. And with the promise that this is going to hold some answer to the question, can I take a sea turtle? Is it okay for my cultural traditional purposes on my island? A lot has gone into the database. The question I would have now is, when will some of the outcomes of it be made available or undertaken by statisticians such as Nick mentioned? I think we keep bringing it all in and trying to seek more, but when and where do we give back the people that have collected it all? I think SPREP is under a greater burden on their shoulders than they ever imagined in attempting to answer this salient question that I've put out there. We didn't just start yesterday. We started in, just say 1990, 2000, 2023. My God, that's 33 years, isn't it? Or is it 43 years? 33. It makes no difference. It's been a long time. It's been a turtle generation at least. Okay, food for thought. Thank you for letting me have a little grandstand there. And maybe Nick has something to say in response. Maybe you can contract Nick to analyze all of the data that you have in there as a give back to the decades of people that have tagged turtle for you.
Thanks, George. We're just about out of time, but we'll let Carlo and Etienne have the floor. You have your hand raised.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Etienne Delattre, the Pacific Bioscape Program Manager. So first of all, I would like to thank very much Nick for the tremendous work that has been achieved to this endeavor, and Nick and everyone else around you, and including some of my teams here that have done a great team effort to come up with this brilliant publication. My question now is directly to you, Nick, as the main author of it. And as much as I'm interested by the life cycle of the turtle, I'm also interested by the life cycle of this manual. So I'd like to get your suggestion, recommendation, your views on how we make sure that this manual really is like a living document. What are your thoughts about opportunities for dissemination, spreading the word around researchers, academics, conservationists? Are there any, events, opportunities where we can disseminate this this important piece of work? I mean, just now that the job is done, how do you see this going next? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Etienne, for the kind words, and yeah, there is. I suppose this is just step one in terms of disseminating the manual. I think, and I allude to this a couple of times in the manual, is that in today's day and age of internet connectivity and PDF availability. I think that's already going to be a huge advantage over previous times where we've printed things that required being in print. There is the upcoming meeting in Fiji, which we could have an event to not launch, but at least present the manual to the audience that would be participating. Next year, there is the International Sea Turtle Symposium, and there are regional meetings from time to time. For example, Australia has its biannual sea turtle meeting for the Australia and Oceania, sort of the southern Oceania region. There are a number of events at which the manual could be presented through a brief presentation and providing both a QR code to download an electronic version of the manual and in-print copies for those people who are old-fashioned like me, who like to hold on to something as they read it. In terms of making it something that's a living document, I'd like to think that as we go down the path and somebody goes, "Hey, Nick, you forgot to put this particular thing in there." Well, it's an electronic document. It shouldn't be that difficult to add in an extra step or an extra process or an extra paragraph. Certainly for the electronic version, maybe not so easy on the in-print version. When I first started writing this, I will admit to thinking I wanted something that was small that people could carry with them into the field, and then I got carried away with the writing, and it's not going to work out like that. But I'm really hoping that it'll be something that people can sit and go, okay, I need to make a decision and I'm not quite sure how, and this is yet one more of those tools in my toolbox to help me get there. I was involved in a process a number of years ago, designing an electronic tool for decision making for dugongs, and so I think that one additional potential is to turn this into an electronic tool that's available through a website. So instead of having to read through a manual, you can literally click on, well, that's my question, and this narrows it down, and this narrows it down, and then you would be presented at the end with a series of choices. I forget the exact name, but I can email it back out to the SPREP team shortly after this, but I could give you a web link to the Dugong tool that does something like that. And I think that would be a useful next step in terms of how we use this data. And then briefly, while I'm speaking, I'm going to answer to George's question about where next with SPREP data. And I couldn't agree more that there is a load of information that has already been collected. A lot of that information has really gone into the Oceania IUCN reports. There's really good synthesis of some of this information, and those syntheses are used to come up with global and regional analyses. So I'd say in many ways, George, the data that has already been collected across the Pacific has been put to very good use in many ways. Could it be used for many more things? Absolutely. And the challenge there is deciding, again, back to the manual, what is it that we want to get out of it, and what do we want to learn, and why, and how do we give that back to the people who might want to know it? So I think that a lot of work has already been done. The fact that more could be done, yeah, absolutely. But I would sort of turn it back and say, right, there has to be a very specific question in mind that we want to answer, so that we can take that data and analyze it in a specific way. Thank you.
Okay, just a last word. Thank you very much for that. And I'm sure Unity has written down your recommendation, suggestion, and I'm looking forward to have you in Fiji at the Turtle meeting on end of November, and we can bring this discussion further.
Excellent.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Etienne. We have a question from Shritika.
Thank you, Unity. Well, not a question, just a comment. First of all, I would like to thank Nick and Sprap definitely for a wonderful work. I was really looking forward to this manual since Karen had mentioned last year. And I will say it is very timely, and rest assured, we will put it to work next month as we begin our nesting season here in Fiji. And simply, I understand what Nick says when you say pocket, manual, and then you think about all this information that needs to be there. And I feel that we don't know how to explain it to people, but as I have gone through the manual right now, I see a very nice descriptive idea of what we are doing, why we are doing, and how we can utilize it in terms of data collection and information for the Pacific region. So, I feel this is an excellent work, and I hope to see some print copies too during the Fiji workshop. Thank you.
That's on you, Carla.
Thanks, Shritika, for that. If you haven't noticed earlier, Karen has posted the link to the manual in the chat, so feel free to click on that link and you can download the manual for free from the Sprep Virtual Library. Right, so we're just gonna quickly move on because we're on borrowed time now. Let me just share my screen. And we'll just quickly go over some of the activities that we are currently involved in or developing under the Pacific Bioscapes program. So in addition to the manual that Nick has developed, the other activity that we have begun is the Vanuatu Tourism Guidelines or Code of Conduct. This is being developed by the Vanuatu Environmental Science Society, led by Dr. Christina Shaw. This Code of Conduct will allow tourism operators in Vanuatu on how to safely and sustainably interact with turtles in the wild. The guidelines we aim to develop will hopefully not only be used in Vanuatu for their tourism operators, but also adapted to have a wider relevance in our region. The public awareness campaign on turtle protection in Papua New Guinea is one of our more extensive activities in the development. And the campaign aims to address the impacts of various threats to marine turtles in Papua New Guinea, including direct take. The awareness materials that we hope to generate from this campaign will also be available for wider distribution and not just limited to Papua New Guinea. And the National Marine Monitoring Coordinators is an activity which will address some issues we faced in the past, where technical support and assistance was very fragmented. By establishing coordinators in each country, we will be able to provide better support for turtle monitoring activities and at the community level and ensure accountability, especially in terms of tags, which seem to always go missing. Turtle monitoring coordinators will be the contact points that we can liaise directly with to address issues and challenges our turtle monitoring communities are facing. We also plan to have a regional workshop to develop activities with countries to conserve turtles. These turtle conservation plans will guide the implementation of specific turtle conservation activities. And finally, we will look to expand and support long-term monitoring of marine turtle nesting beaches, where turtle monitors will use this newly launched Sea Turtle Monitoring Manual, have improved their capabilities in monitoring and data management through training, including how to confidently use the new TREADS database, as mentioned by Nick, as a tool to improve and expand their turtle conservation activities. So that is just a quick, brief overview of some of the activities that we will be involved in or are currently involved in. And would like to open up the floor if anyone has any questions on these activities. It seems like we have no questions. Thank you once again for joining us today. May I now hand over back to Karen for some closing remarks to end our webinar today.
Thanks, Unity. I think that was unexpected, but a pleasure. Thank you. And many thanks to everybody for joining us. We really hope you enjoyed our next presentation. I certainly did. And I absolutely love the illustrations of the turtles. I think it really enhances the manual enormously and reminds us that we shouldn't have to take ourselves too seriously, that although obviously conservation is a serious issue, we should also be able to have fun while we're doing it. So thanks everybody, and I look forward to seeing you potentially at future meetings and training workshops that Unity has just mentioned, that we hope to launch some of this work next year. And obviously the turtle manual that Nick's developed will form a very important basis on the training that we hope to roll out in the next few years. So watch the space. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Unity. Thanks, Carlo and Etienne and the rest of the SPREP team for all the help putting this together over the last year. Thank you.